the talk that I'm going to do for you today is sort of the latest thinking that we've been doing to really incorporate some of the most cutting-edge research and research that's then tied to practice that then loops back to research. That's a really important loop we refer to as praxis that we have right now in the field. Really, in the last decade, we've had some massive breakthroughs that aren't really making it into schools and practice right now in fields like neuroscience, social epidemiology, public health, trauma, and so my work really over the last decade has been about tying in some of the things that I think we know intuitively as educators, and instinctively, the best educators have always done a lot of those things, and now we have really powerful and conclusive science and research, and particularly in the medical field in neuroscience, that is supporting the need for some major pedagogical, cultural, social shifts in schools if we're really going to meet the challenge of equity and if we're really going to meet the needs of the youth that we have historically failed in schools for decades on end, right? And not for lack of talking about them, but really for a lack of connecting, I think, some of the most important work that is going on outside of our field. And allowing that to begin to influence more concretely how we think about curriculum, how we think about pedagogy, how we think about culture, how we think about practice, and really wrestling those things back from corporate interests that have really driven a lot of the stuff that's happening in schools via textbooks, via evaluation, via testing, right? And so this talk is really an effort to both cajole and coach and support educators to reclaim and recenter ourselves in the work that I'm certain most everybody in this room was driven by when they first got into this gig. So the title of this talk is actually based on a quote that is attributed to Malcolm X. And Malcolm said once, "Only a fool would let their enemy teach their children." And you know, if you study Malcolm as a scholar, and you really look at his writing and his speeches and the delivery of his speeches, he was an incredibly intentional man, and particularly in his writing and his speeches, and he deliberately chose certain words that generated, right, real biochemical responses from people based on those words, okay? And so it's not accidental that Malcolm uses the words fool and enemy when he talks about what's going on in schools, particularly for schools that are teaching the nation's most vulnerable youth, okay? And particularly for schools that are teaching children that we have historically not served effectively in schools. Okay. And so as a scholar, I wanted to, and as a writer, and as a, you know, I've been an English teacher for 23 years in my community in East Oakland, and so I'm a lover of words. And I'm always interested in how words are used, how they're chosen, but then what their actual etymological origins are. Okay, because we misuse words a lot in schools, because we don't actually understand what they mean, what their roots are. Okay, so I wanted to really understand Malcolm's decision to use the words fool and enemy in describing the systems that we've built to serve children in the realm of education. And so I looked up the etymology of the word enemy. And the word enemy in the English language comes from the Latin. And it means in amicus, okay, which translates to not friend. Okay, so the word enemy literally sets up a binary, okay, which is critical for us as educators to wrestle with. Because for young people, right, particularly young people that struggle in schools, that struggle in the community, hey, things are very black and white. right? We tend to see things in gray, right? They don't. Okay? Because if they're going to survive the material conditions of their life, which are literally life and death on a daily basis, they have to be able to make quick decisions that are cut and dry. And so when they come to school, we have a sense that they trust us. We have a sense that they're excited to be there. Okay? Right. Yeah, well, we know better, right? Especially the folks in this room, right? But your first-year teacher, right, doesn't get it. Because they're so excited to be there, and they're thinking the youth are excited to be there, and then suddenly, right, they're getting this resistance that they don't really understand, right? And that resistance is about this binary, okay? That the nation's most vulnerable youth must read immediately if you are friend or enemy, okay? There's no time to piece that together if you're walking from the blocks where I live to the schoolhouse and home every day. Okay? There is no gray, right? You make that decision very quickly with the adults in your life, with the institutions in your life, and particularly with people who have power in your life, right? Now, so the word enemy literally translates to mean a thing that harms or weakens something else, right? So that's the first calculus that the children that you're really trying to engage are doing, right? Are you going to do harm to me? Okay. Or, are you my friend? Now the word friend emerges in the English language around the same time in 3 different Germanic languages. Okay. And it literally translates to mean someone or something one knows and with whom one has a bond of mutual affection. On the same side. Okay. This is the calculus that the students you are struggling the most to engage do the second they step foot on your campus. The second they step foot in teachers' classrooms. Okay. Are you on my side or are you going to do me harm? Okay. And once they make that categorical decision, it is really hard for them socially, emotionally, spiritually, biochemically, to move out of that position to the other position. Okay? So what we do in first contact, what we do early on with those kids and families has a massive impact, reverberating over time in their experience in schools and classrooms. Now, the reason that I like this juxtaposition is because if you dig a little deeper in the etymology of the word friend, you find that it actually shares its root word with to love. And it also shares a root with the word freedom. So when you're talking about building a school, an educational system, a classroom that is committed to the principles of friendship with children and families, you have to infuse love. And you have to infuse a collective conversation about freedom. What it means for that child, what it means for that community that you serve to be free. Because if you're not really interrogating those words, then you're not actually grappling with Malcolm's challenge about whether or not you are building a system that is friend or enemy. Now, people have a certain reaction to that quote from Malcolm because they personalize it. And it's not about you. And it's not about me. And that's the first thing you got to put down. Maya Angelou told me once, don't pick it up, and you'll never have to put it down. But we pick it up all the time, right? Because this work is so personal, right? And I get that. But what the point that Malcolm is making is not about you or an individual teacher or an individual. He's talking about is the system of education that we are building in this country the friend of the nation's most vulnerable children and families, or is it their enemy? There is no gray area. You must choose. You must drop your hat on one side of that binary. Right? and then spend your life, your career, really wrestling with what it means to hold that space, to hold a space of love, to hold a space of friendship, to hold a space of care, to hold a space of freedom, okay, inside of that school or that district or that classroom where you serve. Okay? That is the only thing we've ever found to be truly transformational in this field, okay, in the lives of the children that we need to reach the most. Equity and equality are not the same. They are fundamentally different. But we talk about them, we use them interchangeably in our field, okay, which is one of the problems that we face with really building classrooms and schools and systems that are truly community responsive. Okay. Now, I happen to be blessed with a live experiment, okay, into equality and equity in my home. So I literally, live out, okay, a live science experiment. Amaru is constantly thirsty. Tayari is constantly hungry. In the framework that we've built, we got the kid who's hungry, we got the kid who's thirsty, okay, and we do that. Is that equal? There's nothing in the definition of equality that includes fairness. That is actually the working definition of equality. Everybody gets the same. Your reaction is the fact that they're not the same. So that is fundamentally unfair, but we are building a school system on that paradigm, acting as though, okay, a black or brown child from my hood is the same, okay, as a black or brown child that lives in Piedmont. It lives in a wealthy suburban community. Or worse yet, the truth is that we've built an education system, we've built a cultural paradigm in this nation state that says everybody gets to act like they're white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, heterosexual males. And the closer you act to that, the more you get rewarded. And the less you act to that, towards that, okay, the more you find yourself on the margins. Okay? So we've built a system that privileges and benefits, okay, one particular group, and then we've staffed everything around that, okay, that pursuit. If poor kids just had a school system like the wealthy suburban kids, that'd be so much more fair. Okay? No, it wouldn't. Okay? Because kids from my neighborhood and kids from the neighborhoods that many of you serve, okay, have fundamentally different lives, okay, than the lives of the kids in the wealthy suburbs. Okay? So let's not try to build these systems that are equal. Okay? Let's try to build systems that are equitable. We've built a fundamentally unequal system in pursuit of equality, and everybody in the country knows it. Everybody in the country knows that schools serving public schools serving wealthy suburban children, okay, get way more water, okay, than schools serving poor and working class children. Everybody knows it, even though it's the same public system. Even though California says that we created Prop 13 to eliminate that inequality. Okay? And we all know how that's going for us. But we don't even do that. We give wealthy children way more water and a smorgasbord of food. 25, 30 AP courses, tons of enrichment, incredibly robust summer opportunities. Meanwhile, the kids who have the least, okay, not only do they not get the extra water, not only do they not get the smorgasbord of options, but then they're also carrying high levels of vulnerability, economic, political, social, spiritual, emotional. Okay? They're experiencing high levels of trauma because of the levels of violence, social, spiritual, economic, political in the communities, and they're highly isolated. And schools, hey, act as though everything's equal. Okay? And we're going to create this playing field by which we're all judged, okay, on the same measures. It's absurd. We can say 50, 60 years, 30 years, we've made these massive investments in creating a more equal education system. So let's look at the data. Obama's administration recently applauded itself for having achieved the highest rate of high school graduation in the history of the United States. Okay? And they went all over MSNBC and CNN because Fox wouldn't cover it, and they were showing these maps, okay, about how awesome, right, their administration has been. And so I thought, wow, these are really interesting. Let's disaggregate these maps, because I find that what you're talking about is not actually reflective of the experience that I have in my community in East Oakland. And, you know, I'm all over the country. So I'm in Baltimore, I'm in D.C., right? I'm in the D, I'm in Detroit, I'm in L.A., okay? And what you're saying is not what I'm seeing. Okay? So I dug into the data. We are floundering as a nation. Our educational data with the group of children that can least afford to fail in school is some of the worst educational data that we've had in 5 decades. But it's buried because we're not honest. And you cannot be my friend if you will look me in the face and lie. If you will not address my most pressing needs, you are not a system that is committed to loving me, that is committed to my freedom. Okay? And that's what we're wrestling with right now, okay, in the pursuit of equality instead of equity. This is perhaps the most conservative economic data you can find. Okay? This is congressional economic data. Okay? This is straight out of Congress, okay, from the budget office. The United States currently has the largest income gap between its rich and its poor in the history of the industrialized world. Not in the history of the United States, in the history of the industrialized world. We're the champs at inequality. Now, what I love about this map is that, what do you see in the late 70s? What do you see? There's almost no gap. In our lifetimes, we had almost completely eliminated the wealth gap. But because we are so profoundly ahistorical, right, we ignore that. The fact that we had our arms around it. We were not only going in a great direction, we were getting close to home. We had built a system that was radically reducing the inequality gaps between our wealthiest families, okay, and our poorest families. Right? The great news, okay, is that, okay, is in our lifetimes. Okay? It's not some distant historical past that we romanticize. Okay? It's something we can dip back into really quickly and figure out what were we doing there, and schools were fundamentally different. What we were emphasizing in schools was fundamentally different. What we were investing in schools was fundamentally different. Preceding the closing of this gap, okay, to post-Reagan era, right, then into Bush, into No Child Left Behind, into hyper-assessment, into hyper-testing, and this resulting, okay, this massive gap. These are conscious, deliberate decisions that are made not only by policymakers, but then by people like us on the ground who execute those decisions even though we know they're bad for kids. Okay? And the data, okay, is clear that we are heading in a direction that is not only deeply troubling, it's not tenable. You cannot build a pluralistic, multiracial democracy with that. It's not possible. Ask any of the leading political scientists in the country, and they'll tell you, we're in big, big trouble. What the research suggests, okay, is that there's a trinity. Okay, there's a sort of a holy trinity to building agency in children. Right? And this is the work that we've really tried to emphasize with the schools and the districts that we're working with around the country with 10. Okay? And it is these three. Okay, this is what the research bears out. These are the sort of the primary domains for building agency: relationships, relevance, and responsibility. I challenge you to find anything that you are currently using in your school, anything that has the research base that Maslow's hierarchy of needs has. Maslow released the hierarchy of needs in 1943. Okay? It is widely accepted across multiple fields: social epidemiology, neuroscience, the medical field, child development. Okay? All agree that he's right. And he's been right for 80 years. Okay? There's nothing that we're using in schools that has an 80-year multi-field research base. So make sure, okay, that when you're designing culture and practice in your school, that you're embedding Maslow. Okay? Particularly with the kids that are struggling the most. Right? There's your solution system. Right? The kids that are struggling the most have incredible instability in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it is a biological fact, regardless of race, class, gender, language, country of origin. Doesn't matter. This is a human paradigm. Right? Every kid, okay, that has these things under threat, whether they're a wealthy kid in Piedmont or whether they're a poor kid in East Oakland, right, they're going to struggle until those things get stable. Okay? So you can do mentorship and tutoring till the cows come home. For that kid that is really struggling, it's not going to matter. And he or she might get some small, that kid that gets some small gains and you're patting yourself on the back and we're making some progress to them and then boom, they disappear. That's why. Okay? Because that little bit of resource you were giving them was starting to stabilize some of these elements, right? And then some crisis hit him or her and it wasn't enough. Relationships, we start there. Okay? And I open with Herb Cole's book. Okay? Herb Cole wrote this book, I Won't Learn From You, where he coined the term willed not learning. The next time your superintendent's talking to you, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to learn nothing. That's your goal. Okay? Learn nothing. It's really hard. It takes a conscious decision. Willed not learning. How can a child be in a classroom for 6 weeks and have flat zeros on everything? That kid is super committed. I'm serious. Try it. It is really, really hard to not learn. And we have kids doing it all the time. Why? Because they have to protect themselves. Because they've done that math and you are my enemy. You are going to harm me. So I will lock you out. And it is an incredible investment to make. Spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically. To block somebody out for that period of time. Okay? And Herb Cole's book does a great job of capturing the genius behind kids who engage in this practice on a regular basis and the consciousness they have around it, right? And around why they're doing it. But there's a way in which we see those kids as defiant, right? We see those kids as problems when in fact they have this incredible skill and commitment that if we could redirect it, okay, could lead to amazing stuff, right? But we're trying to break them instead of really understand, hey, the relationship, the absence of the relationship that's needed. The only people, hey, that are American, hey, are indigenous people, hey, to this North American land. That's it. Right? So how do we create a school system where kids actually emerge from our school system knowing who they are, proud of who they are, so that they can sit at the table with other people, hey, and mix medicines? Okay? That has to be an imperative. Okay? It can't be a project. Okay? It can't be an after-school program. Right? White kids need ethnic studies too. Knowledge is a gift that you give with no demand for return because it's a gift. You allow children to choose who they think is worthy of receiving that. That should be the intention of schools, is that we give the gift of knowledge, knowledge of self, knowledge of ancestors, knowledge of language, and then children choose who is deserving of that gift in their life. That's what it means to develop relevant schools. And those are the schools that get the highest levels of achievement with the kids who have historically not achieved well. Last is responsibility. So if we've got the relationships and we've got the relevance, then the million bazillion dollar question is, for what? Why are we doing public schools in this country? If not to create a more peaceful society, if not to reduce inequality, if not to create a fully engaged, critical citizenry, why are we doing schools? And how are we measuring any of that? Because I don't see us measuring that in schools right now. What the research suggests is that we are in trouble as a nation. The research also suggests that schools may be the only institution that can wiggle us out of it. If we can do it in a classroom, then we can do it in a school. And if we can do it in a school, then we can do it in a system. And if we can do it in a system, then all that data I showed early on can correct itself. But it has to be the priority. We got to fundamentally rethink why we have schools. That has to be the question that you guys wrestle with every single day with your staff, with your leadership team. Why are we doing this? Keep revisiting your purpose on the planet. Because if you don't, there's a whole bunch of corporations who are happy to provide it for you. And they'll assess it for you too. I end with a story from our ancestors. In this particular case, it's a story from the Cherokee Nation. And the Cherokee people would often tell their children this story about this little boy who runs in the house and he looks at his abuelita and he says, "Abuelita, I feel like there's a battle going on in my head." And she says, "There is, mijo." He says, "Well, who's fighting, abuelita?" And she says, "The two wolves." He says, "Well, who are the two wolves, abuelita?" And she says, "Well, one wolf is rage and greed, selfishness, avarice." He says, "Well, who's the other wolf, abuelita?" She says, "The other wolf is familia, community, amor, cariño." He says, "Well, who wins, abuelita?" And she says, "The one you feed." That's who's going to win. In our communities, in our schools, in our society, is the one we choose to feed. Cut the handle off the well. Change the hose you drink from. And things will fundamentally change with these babies that we're trying to raise through our school system.